My talk is entitled Beyond Devils and Messiahs on the Origin and Meaning of Stalinism. I'm trying to keep it as close to 20 minutes as possible to leave more time for discussion, other speakers. So there'll be stuff left out, and hopefully if I missed it, you want to talk about it in discussion, we can do that. That being said, let's go to the races. So in any discussion on communism, the experience of Stalinism casts a long and foreboding shadow. After all, the Russian Revolution, like the French before it, ended in despotism, purges, and terror. And among both its opponents and defenders, Stalinism is viewed as the inescapable destiny of communism. For the anti-communists, Stalinism, or should we say communism, since they see them as one and the same thing, appears out of nowhere like a bolt from the blue as either a malignant virus, sadistic big brother, or totalitarian reason that seeks to subjugate the world in godless tyranny. By contrast, members of the Communist parties viewed Stalinism as the inexorable unfolding of historical necessity and the only path for humanity to reach communism. Therefore, standing against Stalin meant one was either a fool or a traitor to history itself. Now, whether Stalinism was cast as a hellish devil or a providential messiah, both positions agree that it was the inevitable fate of communism. However, if we conclude to the contrary that communism is not condemned to be Stalinist, then it is necessary to reject this framework to truly understand the origins and meaning of Stalinism. And our search for those roots of Stalinism lie in the concrete material situation confronting the Russian Revolution of 1917. When the Bolsheviks took power, they understood that Russia was too underdeveloped to begin the construction of socialism, and they gambled on their revolution acting as a spark that would inspire the working class to take power in the advanced capitalist countries. And this was not at all unreasonable, since the revolution was on the agenda in Germany, Hungary, Austria, Italy, Spain, Poland, and elsewhere, with strikes, demonstrations, factory seizures, and the like. Yet the bourgeoisie managed to defeat this revolutionary onslaught in the West, and Bolshevism was quarantined inside Soviet Russia. And by 1923, this meant the Bolsheviks had to face the unenviable prospect of taking the socialist road alone. In addition, the Bolsheviks were confronted with the worst possible situation inside Russia itself. Now, the Red Army had successfully defeated the forces of internal counter-revolution and imperialist intervention. But this victory came at a very heavy cost. The country was economically devastated, with industrial production nearly non-existent. The major cities were depopulated, and the peasantry was starving. Moreover, the advanced layers of the working class were killed, dispersed, or absorbed into the institutions of the party state. And in this atmosphere, the Soviets, which were supposed to represent democratic workers' power, had atrophied, and power was now increasingly concentrated inside the Bolshevik Party, which was one of the few institutions capable of holding the country together. But the Communist Party was not the open and democratic organ that it had been in 1917. Now political power was increasingly centralized around Joseph Stalin, the party's general secretary who controlled the vast bureaucratic apparatus. It should be noted that communists were not unaware of this development. They were watching, wondering what it meant for the future. For example, Lenin believed that the bureaucracy was saturated with arrogance, Great Russian chauvinism, and Tsarist authoritarianism. And he feared that if the bureaucracy was allowed to grow, then it would mean the end of the revolution. And Lenin viewed Stalin as the chief representative of this bureaucratic danger and demanded his removal from the position of general secretary. However, Lenin was in ill health at the end of his active political life. And after his death in 1924, Stalin managed to hold on to his position, and the power of the bureaucracy continued to grow. That same year, the political ideology of Stalinism was unveiled with the slogan of socialism in one country. Instead of waiting for world revolution, Stalin proclaimed that the USSR could construct socialism on its own. And many communists inside the Soviet Union found this idea very appealing, since they were tired of the heroic elan of the Civil War years, and they longed for security and stability. Socialism in the country also stoked latent feelings of national pride and the special historical destiny of Russia to lead humanity into its promised socialist future. And by the end of the 1920s, socialism in one country became a full-fledged program of crash course industrialization and forced collectivization to modernize the Soviet Union. And for Communist Party members, Stalin's program was considered the only realistic option for the Soviet Union. At best, Trotsky was seen as an empty-headed dreamer with no sense of the practical needs confronting the USSR. Or worse, and if we're being honest, far more common, as a splitter and a traitor who's threatened to undermine the party with his Menshevik ideas. And even anti-communists, with their negative appraisal of Stalin, saw socialism in one country as the only path open to the USSR. Yet these twin positions share the same underlying assumption that no alternative to Stalinism was historically possible. And this is false, since there are many different programs that could have been pursued. We have the semi-syndicalists of the workers' opposition, represented by Alexandra Kollontai, or market socialism, championed by Nikolai Bukharin and the right opposition. And there was also the communist program offered by Leon Trotsky and the left opposition. And far from being some kind of abstract romantic, I would argue that Trotsky offered a realistic, coherent, and consistent program for the USSR. That beyond prioritizing international revolution, his platform offered a chance for revolutionary renewal that included industrialization, restoring Soviet democracy, cultural revolution, and gradual collectivization. Now, it's true Trotsky's program was not adopted, but it could have potentially either slowed down or reversed the bureaucratization of the USSR. I bring this up because this is not 2020 hindsight. This is not Monday morning quarterbacking or something that happened after the fact. These ideas were developed in real time as Stalinism was developing. I emphasize that to say that there were communist alternatives to Stalinism. And moving on, the political rule of Stalinism was marked by bureaucratic governance, where the Communist Party was controlled by Stalin and the cliques surrounding him, who arbitrarily ruled. But it should be noted that this was not at all unchallenged. Throughout the 20s and 30s, there were various dissident communists who were silenced, expelled, and imprisoned for their real or suspected opposition to Stalin. Yet Stalin's near absolute political power, with the full flowering of the cult of personality, did not truly become a reality until the Great Terror of the late 1930s. And the Great Terror ravaged all aspects of Soviet society: the party, the state apparatus, and Red Army, as enemies of the people were imprisoned and shot en masse. And among the most sensational events of the Great Terror were three show trials of leading Bolsheviks such as Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Christian Rakovsky, Karl Radek, and Nikolai Bukharin, who all confessed to fantastic crimes of sabotage, espionage, and treason to restore capitalism in the USSR in league with Trotsky and foreign powers. And at the time, a majority of foreign communists accepted the guilty verdicts of the Moscow trials without too much question. For others, the Moscow trials raised some very unsettling questions about socialism and the Soviet Union. On the one hand, if the claims of the Moscow trials were true, then the entire Bolshevik leadership who had worked with Lenin and led the revolution were nothing more than traitors, mad dogs. On the other hand, if the trials were falsified, then Stalin was engaged in one of the most fantastic frame-ups in history. In both cases, the trials seemed to confirm that socialism was bound to end in fratricidal violence and tyranny. And it's really not hard to guess why the Great Terror caused so much bewilderment amongst communists and fellow travelers. Irrationality seemed to reign in the USSR as the hunt for enemies became an avalanche of accusations that escaped anyone's control. However, the Great Terror did have a kernel of rationality as a preemptive strike by Stalin against real and suspected opponents. Trotsky himself was the most well-known figure with a clearly defined program in opposition to Stalin. And the trials were necessary to discredit Trotsky by turning him into an arch-enemy of the Soviet Union. So in the courtroom, Trotsky was portrayed as a Judas who was grouped with fascists, bourgeois nationalists, and other counter-revolutionaries. So by amalgamating communist opposition with counter-revolutionaries and criminals, Trotsky's program was transformed from a credible alternative into a cover for a conspiracy of wreckers. And the scale and ferocity of the purges was not the product of socialism, but a struggle between a privileged bureaucracy proactively liquidating any opposition that remained loyal to the ideals of the October Revolution, symbolized by the name and figure of Leon Trotsky. Now, moving on to foreign affairs. Well, it's not quite explicitly stated, socialism in one country in practice meant the subordination of the Communist International and the world revolution to the needs of Soviet diplomacy. To accomplish this, the communist parties had to orient themselves according to the dictates of Soviet foreign policy and not the class struggle. And this strategic approach led to major defeats for the Comintern in Britain in 1926 and in China the following year that compounded the isolation of the USSR. And contrary to the claims of Stalinist realism, the perspective of socialism in one country is detrimental to the interests of both the USSR and the International Revolution. And perhaps its greatest disaster occurred in Germany. And outside of the Soviet Union, Germany possessed the world's largest communist party, the KPD. With a rich history of class struggle, and the Great Depression of 1929 hit Germany especially hard, producing mass unemployment, governmental paralysis, and political radicalization. Now, it's true the Communist Party grew, but so did the base for Hitler and National Socialism. And to onlookers, there was a very clear danger of Hitler coming to power and crushing the organized working class. And from afar, Trotsky implored the communists to form a united front with the Social Democrats to stop the Nazis. Yet following the third period line advanced by the Comintern, the communists considered the Social Democrats to be social fascists who were just as bad, if not worse, than the Nazis. So the KPD launched blanket attacks on all Social Democrats, making no distinction between the rank and file and the leadership. This only served to widen the gap between the two parties. Now, the KPD did claim to support a united front, but only one from below, where the Social Democrats essentially agreed to be communists, which in practice meant no united front at all. And the communists believed that the growth of Nazism was a symptom of capitalism's death agony. They thought that Hitler in power would be short-lived before the inevitable proletariat revolution. To sum up their perspective in one slogan of the time, after Hitler, us. But when Hitler became chancellor in 1933, he proceeded to outlaw all worker parties, and the Communist Party of Germany was crushed without ever firing a shot. And rather than offer a critical balance sheet on these events, the Comintern declared that the KPD's line was completely correct. For Trotsky, the defeat in Germany was a historical test comparable to the failure of the Second International in 1914. And the third period line had the effect of leaving the Nazis alone as they grew in power and alienated social democratic workers rather than winning them over to a united front. Perhaps the third period did not lead directly to Hitler's rise to power, but it did next to nothing to stop it. And the Comintern leadership under Stalin should bear shared responsibility for what happened in Germany. After 1933, the USSR faced a revanchist and anti-communist Germany that was rearming for war. So the needs of Soviet foreign policy dictated collective security with Britain and France to contain the Third Reich. And the Comintern accordingly shifted its line once again from the third period to something called the Popular Front. Now communist parties were instructed to build broad fronts with not only socialists, but also bourgeois parties on a program of anti-fascism and support for the USSR. And the Popular Front, with its defense of democracy, meant the effective abandonment of revolutionary aspirations. Instead of operating as proletarian vanguards, the communist parties acted as brakes on popular struggle. And the counter-revolutionary nature of the Popular Front was most clearly on display during the Spanish Civil War. Franco's military coup had sparked a massive social revolution behind Republican lines. Yet the Spanish Communist Party, following the lead of Soviet foreign policy, prioritized winning the war. They believed that a socialist revolution would only frighten Britain and France away from an alliance with the USSR. As a result, the Communist Party was instrumental in rolling back the revolution and restoring governmental authority to the bourgeoisie. Anarchists and Trotskyists who were determined to carry the revolution forward were considered dangerous fifth columnists who must be eliminated. And this was most dramatically demonstrated with the torture and murder of the radical socialist Andrei Nin in 1937. Yet despite the compromises of the Popular Front, it led not to victory in Spain or to collective security. So in August of 1939, the USSR abandoned the Popular Front by signing a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. And communists worldwide struggled to rationalize their defense of the USSR following the signing of the pact with their hated fascist enemies. Now, while those claimed that the pact bought time for the USSR to prepare for war, this was belied by Soviet actions. And I will only pick three here, even though there are actually many more I could discuss. For one, the USSR gave needed raw materials to the Third Reich that actually made it easier for them to attack. Two, the military purges of previous years had drastically weakened the Red Army, particularly at its highest levels. Third, and I would actually argue most damning, Intelligence from Soviet spies about an imminent German invasion was willfully ignored by Stalin. So when the 3 million soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the largest land army invasion in history, invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the country was taken completely by surprise. Now, it's true the Red Army did win the war, but this came at a high price, and I would argue that this happened despite and not because of Stalin's military leadership. The Comintern itself was unilaterally dissolved by the Soviet Union in 1943 as a gesture of goodwill to the Western Allies. But this didn't really change much for the communist parties who followed the needs of the Soviet Union throughout the war. And the goal was not world revolution, but defeating fascism. So communists who led anti-fascist struggles in France, Greece, and Italy, with a notable exception of Yugoslavia, actually, did not fight for any form of social revolution, but restoring democracy and national independence. Furthermore, at various conferences with the Allied powers, Stalin agreed to the division of Europe into separate spheres of influence. Eastern Europe will be dominated by the USSR, while the West would remain capitalist. So after the war, the new Eastern European people's democracies replicated the Stalinist structure of nationalized economies and bureaucratic rule. Ultimately, Stalinist leadership of the USSR and the Comintern proved to be devastating. By sacrificing world revolution for realpolitik, Stalin made major blunders that threatened the existence of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the leadership of the communist parties, who willingly followed every zigzag of Soviet foreign policy, ensured that they lost many opportunities for proletarian revolution. Now, to begin wrapping up, for many disillusioned communists who were repulsed by the crimes of Stalinism, it was only natural for them to talk about their loss of faith in the God that failed, as one famous anthology put it. As communists, they believed in a new savior, but found themselves serving a false messiah who used the language of historical necessity to betray their hopes and dreams of a better world. And now, repentant, these former communists embrace a new mantra, where it is a secular folly to use totalitarian reason to transform human nature. And if one accepts these articles of faith, then any talk of changing the world to do away with private property is effectively rendered impossible. And when Stalinism is seen as either a devil or a messiah, then it can only be explained by moralism and mysticism. Yet comprehending Stalinism is not beyond human reason. The tools of historical materialism enable us to understand the roots of Stalinism come from the material conditions of isolation, backwardness, and scarcity prevailing in Russia. After the revolution and civil war, the working class was reduced to impotence, while many of its most active members were absorbed into the Red Army and the party state. And this historical situation fostered the creation of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Ultimately, Stalinism can be defined as a form of bureaucratic rule over collectivized property relations, which were originally meant to foster Soviet democracy. And its governing ideology was the nationalist idea of socialism in one country, not Leninist internationalism. Certainly, in a very formal way, Stalinism grew out of Bolshevism in the sense that one followed the other. However, just as the Stalinist bureaucracy was parasitic upon the USSR's economy, it was parasitic upon the ideas of Bolshevism. The party continued to call itself Bolshevik and used the same slogans, but these were a form of camouflage, where the revolutionary essence was empty. And the Stalinist program of socialism in one country represents the repudiation of proletarian internationalism. In fact, Stalinism grew out of Bolshevism not logically, but as its negation and betrayal. And the first victims of Stalinism were Marxists and communists who had fought for the October Revolution. And in the end, we can and we must reject the dual claims of both anti-communists and Stalinists that communism is bound to end in bureaucratic rule and terror. We should instead envision and fight for a communism free of Stalin's deformations. And that means taking up the banner of genuine Marxism with its program of international communist revolution and a new society free of exploitation and oppression ruled by the working class. Thank you.